Good afternoon and welcome to eNCALive. This week we're discussing the state of youth in South Africa. Quite a broad topic, but considering it's Youth Month, we decided to just go with it. Today we've got Lee Molefe with us as one of our guests, as well as Owethu Makatini, both very young, industrious people. We also have Erin Bates, who will be giving us some of the social media responses and also just telling us what people have been saying in response to some of the questions that we've put out relating to Youth Day, Youth Month, and all things young people. So, I'm gonna throw this out there to one of you. We have Youth Month every year. Just before we started, you were discussing the fact that last year you were involved in a very similar panel discussion. Is there a point behind Youth Month, or are we just kind of doing the same thing over and over again?
I think people like to use Youth Month as a time to spotlight youth issues. And while that can be appreciated, I think also we do need to be wary of making youth issues only a form of conversation or only a matter of our conversations during Youth Month. Mm-hmm. I mean, our topic in itself, the state of SA youth, is extremely broad. The term in itself, youth, we often make the assumption that sort of young people are a homogenous group, but they're not. So the state of any young person is dependent on a range of things, anything from race to gender to class to where you are, to whether or not you can even watch this conversation take place, right? Yeah. So the state of SA youth really isn't something we could discuss in a month, let alone a year. So I think it's very, very important that, these conversations such as this happen outside of Youth Month, but there is some importance to Youth Month in the sense that we do have a time to spotlight youth issues, such as the fact that youth issues don't get discussed outside of Youth Month, ironically.
To you, Owethu, do you think that there's something that we are fundamentally missing every year when we have these discussions either about Youth Day or about Youth Month?
I think that because you always have the same kinds of discussions, we're always going to get the same kinds of answers. So I think we really need to be innovative in the way that we ask questions. What are we really interrogating? What do we really want to change? Who are we holding accountable for those changes? I don't think even framing things as youth issues, that's placing agency on the youth who are largely structurally unable to contribute in the ways that they need to. So saying youth issues is problematic as well. So I think, just as an aside, it's important, even in the language that we're using to talk about youth issues, when you say youth issues, it's what are those? Who sets the debate? Which youth? 18 to 35? Is a 35-year-old facing the same challenges and issues as an 18-year-old? I think we're going to continue to have the same conversations over and over again unless we change what we want to know fundamentally and unless we change our line of questioning.
So to both of you, you've both brought up the issue of the conversation and the type of conversation you're having. What conversation would you perhaps like to see happening beyond this Youth Month, whether it be later this year or even next year, Youth Day time?
I think the key thing is that, so I could speak on a particular issue that I think is important to youth, and that would be great. That would be a great contribution to the conversation. However, I'm sitting on a platform, right? And so I think the key thing here is platforms. I think we need to be able to set up the kind of platforms that ensure that debates and discussions continually happen all the time. And who takes part in that debate, who takes part in that conversation is the really critical thing. And not to just have sort of Lee Molefe and Owethu Makatini sitting here discussing and talking about sort of a range of issues that are particularly pertinent to us. However important and however relevant, but in terms of what is the ultimate thing we should be talking about, there's such a large range of things.
But maybe
that we need
one
to
thing
discuss.
that you think we really need to be talking about and we're not talking about at all. People are always bringing up unemployment as this, this big thing. But what about unemployment? What about youth unemployment are we not perhaps looking at?
So again, the same theme emerges, the same kind of characteristic emerges. So even when we're talking about youth unemployment, the interventions that we dream up to meet youth unemployment are largely not dreamt up by young people. The National Youth Policy was, I mean, you know, included a very small part of the South African young population in its responses, and thus in how it's entirely constructed. So the key thing, the key theme here is that we need more young people to be involved in the conversation a lot more of the time. And ultimately what emerges out of those conversations will be richer and will be better suited to finding solutions for it. So we could be discussing anything. We could be discussing race. We could be discussing youth unemployment. We could be discussing any range of issues that do affect youth very sharply. However, if you don't have young people very, very sharply involved in that conversation, immediately it threatens to make the solutions that we could dream up irrelevant to them. So for the National Youth Policy, for example, there's lots of interventions in there that, while I can appreciate the fact that A, we do have a National Youth Policy, B, that there were young people that did dream it up, I'm not sure it exactly speaks to, you know, the people it's meant to speak to most, right? And even in the interventions that are dreamt up, I'm not sure it responds to the context of the young person who perhaps needs it most. And it's quite inherent, and like Owethu said earlier, there's so much structural and institutional sort of othering that takes place that you know, that it's very, very difficult for that young person who perhaps needs access most to even access the kind of access that will get them access. Yeah. If that makes any kind of sense, you know. So
I kind of understood it. There's a lot of access to
exactly. No, but this is the thing, you know. So I think we need an appreciation of the fact that A, there are many young South Africans that aren't part of that conversation. If we don't make it a critical part of our youth interventions to make sure that we have a broader range of young South Africans involved in that conversation, it's going to hurt our ability to even begin to meet them, to meet the challenges.
So just before we go back to your way to talking about access, Erin,
yes,
you've been watching what's been going on social media. We've put a couple of questions out to some of the people about Youth Day in general, and also about, you know, this discussion about youth in South Africa. What are you hearing back from social media?
Well, just to kind of, you know, put out a disclaimer at first, obviously we have to understand that Twitter itself is a kind of a funnel, and that only certain people have access to Twitter and are able to engage on the conversation, or even know that we're looking for answers. So if you are watching and you'd like to participate, please follow at eNCA and use the hashtag eNCALive and Youth Month to participate. But we've had some response really on the job issue. That's a very strong theme. It came up on Youth Day itself, and it's come up again now. I'll include a few tweets just to kind of get things going. We have one here from Sianda who says, "We're unskilled, youth are unskilled. Our education is a joke, which makes us unemployable, and that in turn turns us into a generation of protesters and slaves." Then another one here from Petros who says, "The youth must have internships, learnerships, recreation and sports facilities, and economic growth and job creation." So just two examples there of people on Twitter, young people I would assume, who are highlighting this issue of job creation, learnerships, education, access to kind of information as well. Another tweet I saw on that. So around this kind of development of oneself and then moving into the economy.
That tweet about being turned into protesters and slaves, quite strong language there. Really looking at the issues that we face in South Africa, where we do see a lot of youth protesting around various issues, and it generally gets framed as service delivery. Maybe you could tell us a bit about how you got to where you are, Owethu. You with retroviral digital communications, and you're very focused on social media.
Yes.
But what does your work telling you about the youth in South Africa? I mean, are you able to actually monitor that?
Yes, actually we do use tools that monitor activities on social. But before I answer that question, I just want to say, in terms of a way forward, I think by and large we have missed the boat in terms of a lot of solutions that we should have implemented at least 20 years ago. And I think instead of South Africa trying to focus on rectifying mistakes or trying to address the violent backlog that we face on service delivery and education, I think South Africa and Africa in a larger scale can position itself through digital technology, not just social media, through digital technology to leapfrog ourselves, right? And we have the mayor of Joburg Parkstyle has a Vulindlele Jozi program, which aims to make Braamfontein a hotspot. So that's just one of those places. That's important. That's important to say, this is the way that the world is going, and the majority of the youth understand and consume content in different ways than they used to do. So it's important to talk to people where they are. If you're going to talk about the youth, like you can't really have conversations about people. You need to have conversations with people. And by and large, the youth is excluded, as Lee mentioned. So I think, as a way forward, we need to employ digital technology to leapfrog ourselves and do things that are innovative and creative that the government needs to subsidize. Like in America, there are teenagers in the Bronx who are creating apps that are addressing social issues. Who is in a better position than a child in the township who bears the brunt of every kind of ism to create a solution through technology? It's things like that where these things exist, the research is out there. You can do desktop research and see 20 apps made by black women. And these are important. There's an app called Educate. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's an entrepreneurship portal. And basically what it does is that it curates all of this sort of information, and entrepreneurs can talk to each other and mentor each other. And that's important. The government should be looking forward in that way, as opposed to trying to pander to past regulations that weren't even made with the youth in mind to begin with.
Okay. Again, the government coming into it, but should we be waiting for the government?
No.
Shouldn't businesses and NGOs and just people in general be pushing for these kind of developments?
Yes, definitely, because I think a lot of people are afraid of technology. And that's unfortunate, because understanding basically what technology is opens up a whole portal of opportunities, not just for young people, but for the economy. So fostering a spirit of entrepreneurship through digital technology will open up amazing opportunities, not just for the youth, but for the whole country. So I don't think it's a matter of waiting for the government to do anything. The government has its parts that it has to play, which is policy making and legislation and things like that. And then the youth, we are the youth that is saying, by and large, we're not waiting for handouts. We need access to access to access. We need the bureaucracy to disappear, and we need to be able to be encouraged to do things. We're not waiting for anybody, especially, I'm born in 1993, so I'm like, call myself a peripheral born free. I was just there, like, just
almost.
There. I was just there. So we're the type of people that have been sold the Rainbow Nation dream, and we've come to a point where we're like, with campaigns like Roads Must Fall, we've come to a point where we're just like, that hasn't worked. And we're holding you accountable, and this needs to change, and it needs to change now, and we're in the middle of that conversation. So if the government doesn't take us seriously as a youth, things are going to change whether they're with us or they aren't. And I think it's important for the government, where they are right now, to understand their place, to enable us, as opposed to try to hold our hands, because that's not going to help anyone. Nobody's growing in that sense. So that's what I think.
I want to ask a question just on that, if I may, and that's around structural change, because what happened with the Roads Must Fall campaign, for example, and you've spoken about service delivery protests as well, is there's a degree of kind of discontent and a degree of challenge, and then to a point it simmers down, and to a point it's contained, even I would argue with something like Roads Must Fall. And you're dealing with a youth that's engaged with technology. If they're in cities, they're already hip, they're up to speed on things, and they're kind of dynamic. So there's a materialism on the one hand, and there's a call for really structural change on the other. As someone born in 93, how do you reconcile those two things? Because to my mind, there's a bit of a conflict there.
I'm so glad you asked that question. I've never really met anybody who really wants to know what's happening right now and how we are addressing those things. So I love that question. It is very difficult, because on the one hand, you are talking about years and like decades, centuries of oppression, and trying to undo the mistakes of the past, but also you taking pictures of this protest on your iPhone. Like, what's important, I think, for me is constantly checking my privilege. Like, if I do have the space or the platform to speak on things, I feel it's my responsibility to be as informed as I can be about whatever it is I'm speaking about. I wouldn't come here today and waffle because I'm here today to represent the youth. And I think that is one of the channels in accountability, being responsible, not only to who you represent, but to yourself. I would never say anything that I can't justify or that I don't fundamentally believe in. So it starts with introspection more than anything else, saying, I understand that I'm privileged, I went to good school, I went to Rhodes. That's an important distinction, to say I'm able to articulate my lived experience better than most because I have the language to do so. So it's constantly checking ourselves, constantly checking our elitism, even in the academic space, saying the lived experience of people is just as fundamental to the conversation as the academic theory that supports it. So it's a matter of, it's a constant push and pull. It's not, there's no point where you get and you're like, well, I am a social justice warrior and I've done everything. That's not how it's a constant push and pull. It's a constant checking of privilege as well. And honestly, it's very uncomfortable a lot of the time. But I think we're the generation that is willing to be uncomfortable. We're the generation that's willing to do the work ourselves and then just get some help along the way.
So I just want to, sorry to interrupt you there. We're going to take a little break and we're going to play some of the videos that people have actually sent us with their comments about Youth Day, looking at some of the issues like what they believe is slacktivism instead of some real activism taking place, things that they believe are important that aren't being addressed, and then we'll be back in a few minutes.
For me, what matters to me is having good role models. Since I believe currently in South Africa, we are getting less and less of role models because they are driven by greed, corruption, most of the leaders in South Africa. So I think we need good role models, people that we can look up to, people that can inspire us. I think it will be unemployment. We should come up with ways of reducing unemployment so that we can alleviate poverty.
Whenever Youth Day rolls around, I'm always in a conflict of emotions between being humbled and sad about the lives that have been lost in this country and the incredible sacrifices that have happened, but also inspired by people who have made a change. And I think my biggest, perhaps, frustration now with people my age, with the youth of South Africa, is a lack of activism. There's a slacktivism where we'll tweet about things, but not do anything more than that, really.
In terms of South African youth, I think that we have made such great strides in this country, but we need just to do a few more things, and we're going to need the elders of this country to help us, you know. My concerns are healthcare and how people access healthcare, and if people have programming that speaks specifically to them. Because what I'm noticing is that if you are able to destigmatize homosexuality, being transgender, destigmatize living with a disability, and we are able to see these populations represented well in all our media, represented in ads that speak about HIV prevention. If you can walk into a clinic or actually watch an ad with a gay couple and it's about condoms, that's what we need. You need, as a person sitting there, to know that your country cares about you beyond what your identity and beyond, you know, who you sleep with and whatever, and it's about getting you healthcare, it's about speaking to you. So I really think we need to, you know, fix that up, and we'll be on our way to making great improvements.
My name is Monwabisi Zungu. I'm from Ladysmith, and what matters most to me is kindness, showing kindness in the form of respect. That matters most, and forgiveness. I think that played a huge role in where we are today as South Africa. And gratitude. You need to have a lot of gratitude for our past and on all our chances as a youth. And most of all, we need to love ourselves in order for others to love. That's what matters the most.
Hi, I'm Refilwe, and what matters to me most as a South African youth is carrying the baton forward from our forefathers and just fighting our new struggles.
What matters to me this Youth Day, this Youth Month, is business. Focus on small, medium enterprises. Youth run small, medium.
We've got some very young, industrious people with Molefe, if we could throw it to you, just before the break, we were discussing, this idea of perhaps slacktivism and activism. Rhodes Must Fall came into it, and the privileged places that we actually find ourselves in. Here we're having this discussion in a great set at eNCA, but there are a lot of people that don't actually have access to this kind of discussion and who can't actually watch it. How do we go about actually reaching those people?
I think there's the expression. I think we're seeing our society show a lot more expression, a lot more political expression, except when you're in a different part of a society, your political expression finds a voice in different ways. I think social media has played an incredibly important part in sort of surfacing a lot of the contentions that already existed around sort of identity, around privilege, around so many themes that dominate our society. And I think, it's particularly stirred by social media today. I'll give you an example. When you think of the xenophobic attacks in 2008, when you think of sort of the sense or the sort of the sense of ambient discussion around xenophobia in 2015 versus in 2008, when arguably the violence lasted for longer and more people were involved, yet there was less of sort of a sort of psychological impact on the society and perhaps less of a global impact on South Africa's image. It really boils down to social media. It really boils down to the fact that people could share an image very quickly. It really boils down to the fact that people can share an opinion very, very quickly. And I think we're seeing a lot more of that. We're seeing a lot more of people's sort of frustrations, people's aspirations come to the fore a lot more easily and get shared a lot more easily because of social media. Where that becomes slacktivism, well, I think that's an interesting debate because so for example, again, with the recent xenophobic attacks, there was, the idea that a lot of people were sort of desktop protesters or sort of sitting on the sidelines and saying all the right things, but not actively doing anything more broadly. I don't know that that's a debate we should be having, really. I think there's different forms of finding expression that are all equally as important. So if one person wants to sit on Twitter and make their opinions known, they're very, very welcome to, in my opinion. Whereas if somebody else feels the need to actively get into the streets and express themselves that way, I think they're very open to as well. And on the issue of what somebody said about young people being in the streets and protesting and so forth, again, expression and how expression finds itself depending on who we're talking about.
But just if I can just play devil's advocate, I mean, we do see a lot of the people that are trying to express themselves and trying to get sort of government's attention through these protests. The evidence from pictures and videos that we do see are that there are a lot of young people, feel very discouraged. And unfortunately, all of that gets lumped under this category of service delivery protest or protest over this or that or the next thing. So I suppose the question is, shouldn't we perhaps be finding different ways to actually assist some of those people to get their message across in a different manner where it isn't lumped under service delivery protest? Because that could be anything. That could be about electricity, it could be about education. And at the end of the day, when the news cameras leave, the situation hasn't changed necessarily.
And again, it's a matter of culture, right? So South Africa sort of has a culture of protest that we inherited from apartheid, where civic engagement was literally gathering in a mass and being seen far sooner than being heard. And I think that's something that will change over sort of a long time, and it's something we continue to have a hangover of. So I agree that we do need more sort of lightning rods or outlets for an anger and for a resentment and a disillusionment that exists. However, we should be very, very careful of how we understand it and of how we categorize it and how in perhaps some instances we dismiss it. So I agree with you that, and again, to my point that I made earlier, people find political expression, people find expression in different ways depending on where they are. So somebody may not have a social media outlet when they're in Bakersdale, and so an immediate sort of response for them would be to protest, right? And I think also importantly how people in the media, how our society sort of understands that is absolutely critical. How we view that and sort of how we consume the information that comes out of those is absolutely important. And I think a lot of the time we focus on the fact that there are people protesting, and we don't focus and we don't go, well, what is it that brought an entire group of people to this position? What is it? What is the contention that brought an entire people to be in a position where they feel like they need to strike? So I think we're seeing a lot of expression, which I think is good, and I think naturally sometimes this expression will find itself in different ways. Sometimes it's Rosemar's Fall, other times it's Bigger Star, other times it's social media activism, sometimes slacktivism. But I think we do need to be, importantly, we do need to be able to leverage of the fact that we do need to be able to identify the opportunity, which is that we're seeing a lot more debate in our society, we're seeing a lot more expression in our society, which is something that I think we can build upon.
To hop in there with some expression from social media, we've got a tweet here from Onga, who kind of throws issues around what we do, whether it's expression or whether there's any action or change, right at us at eNCALive. Onga says on Twitter, after sending you those questions, what are you going to do about it? The issue is, I need community service. Interestingly, though, on Twitter saying, I need service delivery, I need community service in my area. And then another follower on Twitter, Zandile, says, substance abuse is the main issue we youth face today. And that's something we haven't really touched on. We've spoken about unemployment, substance abuse, and then also I'd like to throw into the mix as well the issue of gender violence. There were 2 attacks in the Northwest against young women who were both brutally murdered in a sort of rural. Their bodies were found in a rural area of the Northwest. It's something that I think is an important issue to address: youth gender violence.
Well, I think it kind of ties in with something that we discussed before about whether the youth are being involved in creating the solution. I mean, you do have a lot of sort of community policing forums, you do have a lot of forums within different areas, but a lot of the times those are not involving the younger people within the society. Are there ways that we could be, particularly when it comes to violence, whether it's gender violence or anything else, be involving young people more?
There's always scope to involve young people, fresh ideas, innovation. That's always going to be the case. But I think in terms of gender violence, we need to really, as a country and as a society, really investigate the work that we're doing for and on behalf of girls and women. We need to really unpack cultural practices that have become norms that are fundamentally violent psychologically and physically to women and to children. Even in everyday debates, I think since becoming conscious of the microaggressions towards women and the sexualization of young children, it's important for us as a society to put that on the agenda as well and critically engage in the ways that men in the workplace, men in taxi ranks, men in boardrooms address women. And that's a cultural task that we have to take on ourselves. And unfortunately, more than anything, it's always women championing these sorts of movements. And then we have a whole government departments, women, children, and people with disabilities, that is silent. They are shockingly inactive in those spaces. So I think it's very important to employ young feminists, young womenists, like how I identify myself, people who are able to look at the intersectionality of oppression, because it doesn't happen in one go. Patriarchy doesn't come and say, oh, it's my hour, I'm going to do what I need to do, and then leave, and then misogyny comes in, and then misogynoir, and then trans-misogyny. These are terms that people need to be familiar with. Just as much as we're familiar with words and phrases that demean women and young girls, we need to be familiar with the ways in which we're doing so. And once those conversations are starting, and by and large those are happening on social media, thankfully, and people are being called out on their misogyny and their misogynoir. So it's important to develop a feminist agenda, because feminism is common sense at the end of the day.
But
I do think, though, we also need to complicate that conversation because it's so easy to say women, children, they're the targets here. And you just have to look at that video, which was, to some extent, we understand, racially charged, where boys in a dorm were raping another boy, to show that sexual violence is not simply man-woman. It's much more complicated than that.
Agreed.
And violence and sexual violence and the kinds of aggression that happen in male circles as much as they might happen towards women and children. It's the dynamics, the character of it that are different.
Yeah, it's very complicated and it's very complex. But I think as a starting point, it's significant for us to look at, because even when men talk to each other, men talk to men about women. They don't talk to women about women. It's just this conversation happening above our heads about what we should be doing, what we should be wearing, where we should be going. Even in social settings, it's men talking to men. And even violence towards men and boys is largely taught through the violence that's allowed to continue through women. So I think it's a fantastic starting point to say, sure, nobody's saying that the violence between the dynamics between men and women and men aren't important, but we need to unpack that as well to say, even men, what is this that they're associating? They're associating that with making you feel like a girl. That's a problem. So we need to start where that problem is and unpack that and tease that out before we can get into, and it's not even before we can get into other conversations. These things have to happen in tandem. We need to tease and break down these things that we've accepted as cultural norms.
Yeah. Right.
We need to, they happen all at once. I'm black and I'm female. I don't just be black in one instance and just be female in another. The way that I interact with the world and the way that the world interacts back with me is as a young black female. That's not things that are compartmentalized. So even in the conversation, we should say, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how it's a myriad of issues that are dynamic and complex. What are we going to do about that? How are we going to unpack and tease that?
I think the one thing that's definitely come out of today's discussion is that whatever the state of youth in South Africa is, it really is the state of South Africa.
Right.
You don't really have to have the youth in it. I mean, the unemployment issues that we face are not only issues that the youth face, it's issues that the country face. The issues that we've just talked about violence, about having your voice heard, those are also South African issues. And I suppose
that importantly need the youth voice, because as much as that is true, you also in some instances have a situation where youth are particularly vulnerable to anything that is in fact a South African issue.
Yeah.
So for example, with what Owethu is saying, in complete agreement with Owethu, as much as we are a violent society as a whole and we see violence more generally, we do need to be aware that some members of our society are more vulnerable to violence than others. And that's not a part of the conversation that we can or should ignore at all. And again, back to the issue of political expression, sorry, just very, very quickly, I think this is what's great about it, that we're seeing a lot more people calling each other out, that we're seeing a lot more people saying, well, I want to talk about race, I want to talk about gender, I want to talk about it authentically and straight up, and in a very, very real and in a way that references a very, very real lived experience. So I think there's a massive opportunity there.
So we unfortunately have run out of time. We're close to the end, but I really would love you guys to just wrap. Next year, this time, when we're discussing youth, what is one issue that you want to see on the agenda that you haven't seen this year? Very quickly.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I just want for us to address gender parity through digital technology. I want girls and women to be at the forefront of the conversation.
Okay.
I want to be talking exclusion. That young people and exclusion is something that we've even inherited from our long history, and I want to see us talking more about exclusion next month. And having a much stronger conversation about exclusion next year. But I'd really like to see us have better conversations about including more people in the conversations that we have. And also, I think importantly, we need to be able to create platforms for debate. So, for example, on the platform that we run, livevip.co.za, I'd really like to see people actively debate more. I like to see young people I want to see a political analyst on eNCA that is young. rather than one that is not so young discussing youth issues.
Yeah.
So again, I would like to, and very, very much, if we have this conversation again next year, I'd like to be able to say, well, I think on the issue of exclusion, we've seen a lot more inclusion of young people in the conversations that are pertinent to them.
Okay. We're going to have to wrap there. I'm sorry to cut you off. Thank you very much to everyone who watched eNCA Live today, and thanks to our guests. Thank you to Erin. This will be your last eNCA Live debate with us.
So.
She's moving on to bigger and better things. We hope to see you again when our production break comes to an end. We'll be going off air for about a month, but we'll be seeing you again with some more exciting debates, and we're hoping to tackle more interesting issues in the coming months.